The second session is titled Beyond Journals and New Forms of Digital Publishing. And in order to keep people on time, we've put electric shock devices into the chairs here. And if you go over, the other people on the panel get shot. No, wait a second. When we organized this session, there was, of course, no way we could cover the entire scope of basically everything other than journal publishing in this area. But we wanted to represent sort of some of the breadth of what people are doing and talking about and thinking about that's beyond sort of the traditional just publishing a scholarly journal or variants of publishing a scholarly journal. And so you will see a few different examples of concepts and ideas and things in practice related to going beyond journal publishing. And our first speaker is Carly Strasser from the California Digital Library, and she will be talking about data publication.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Okay, does that work? Seems very far. All right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a little bit about data publication and then also some kind of more broad things, but I'm hoping that the panel is going to jump in and talk more about the specific things that they've been thinking about and working on in this space. So I'm Carly Strasser, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself as well as John Kratz, who's a CLEAR postdoctoral fellow at CDL working on data publication. So just to kind of set the stage, if we think about the way science is working these days, if we think about how it worked back in the day, right? So back in the day, it was a lot of dudes hanging out and working on science, and a lot of them were doing it by themselves in their labs, writing in their notebooks. Maybe they had an assistant or two. And of course, everything got documented very well in those notebooks. And so that's how we can talk about the things that Newton thought about, or the way that Curie, really developed her ideas. And so when we think about that in terms of how things are different, research has definitely changed, and it's changed both for the better and for the worse. And so there's lots of really good things about how science and research in general has shifted. First, of course, there's so much data now. We all love that term, big data. And this is a book of the entire human genome published, which is a pretty cool concept. And so we can imagine that this is only going to increase over time. We're going to get more and more data, and that's very different from maybe 300 years ago. Also lots of tools, so plenty of things that we can do with the data sets using various software and hardware and all kinds of fun new techniques that have been developing over time. And then, of course, the thing that we've heard about a little bit already today, which is that we have lots of the internet to help us communicate with each other, to really talk to each other, and to really facilitate a community of science that's very far beyond just the people that you sit next to in a laboratory. And so it's also changed, of course, for the worse. This isn't to say that digital data is a bad thing. It's just to say that it's challenging. So having our primary data being generated digitally, being born digital, means that we have to think really carefully about how we're going to document the data that we're creating, the instruments that we're using, the settings on those instruments that we used, and things can really get lost in the shuffle. And of course, everybody's using these very complex workflows. So if you ask a given researcher, they'll probably use several different kinds of programs over the course of generating the work that they end up publishing, unless you're really awesome and all you have to do is use R and Sweeve, which some people do. I don't know, not me. Okay, so you have these digital data, you have these complex workflows, and as a result of all that, you generally have these items going into a black box, and then on the other side you have this publication that comes out. And it's very difficult to try and parse what happened between the ideas and the data collection and the analysis of the data, and then the publication of that paper. And so we really have a problem of very little provenance. Apparently I need to log in. Okay. And so we hear these phrases that are coming up a lot, things like reproducibility crisis. Excuse me. So we're having a harder and harder time being able to track exactly how people have gone from their ideas all the way to their published work. There's this concept of a digital dark age, which I heard for the first time a few years ago, and I kind of love it. It's basically saying, back in the day everything was written down. Now we have all of these digital implements, but nobody's really doing a good job of capturing or documenting what's happening there. And what's going to happen potentially is in 10 years or 20 years or whenever we figure out digital data, we're going to look back on this time and think, wow, we really don't have, thank you, getting over a cold, we really don't have documentation of exactly what happened in these years. And then there's this idea of the erosion of trust of scientists. And so you can go to any major newspaper these days and find out that the public is skeptical in a lot of cases of what we're saying and trusting us to really be honest with them and report honestly about what we're working on. So this is the question, can we fix science or research? And maybe it doesn't need to be fixed so much, but I do like to think we need to fix the way that we communicate our science. And so that's a little bit different. It's a little bit more nuanced potentially, but science itself isn't really the problem here. I think it's just the way that we're writing down what we're doing and the way that we're telling others about what we're doing. So if we think about science as a spectrum where the way that we're going to try and fix it is to either change nothing or change everything, there's all kinds of ideas that are popping up right now. We're in this great period where ideas are being generated and people are really thinking about how to change scholarly communication. And kind of in the middle is where a lot of the things I'll talk about here and maybe to some extent what people might talk about on the panel are thinking about. So a lot of people are kind of thinking about working within the existing publishing paradigm when we think about changing science. We're trying to think about ways to incentivize sharing and reproducibility of science, and maybe looking at the advent of new tools and how we can incorporate those into the kinds of systems that we already have in place. And so, like I was saying, we're in the midst of this culture shift, and I, for one, am incredibly nerded out about it. I love it. I think it's amazing to watch and to be a part of this, to see the development of the way that academic publishing is going and how people are thinking about this, and the best way to approach these new problems that we're facing. And so it's an interesting question to ask, what is scholarly communication going to look like in 10 years? Is it going to look like it does now with a few caveats or a few extra bells and whistles, or is it going to look completely different? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I love thinking about it. And of course, anything open is a very popular idea these days, and so this is really feeding into that idea of us needing to change the way that we communicate science. So with the advent of the internet, we are able to be open. We're able to have open notebooks, we're able to do open source software, we're able to have open access publications, make our data open. And that's something that we really need to start taking advantage of and exploiting as a community that supports scholarly research. So if you're not aware of the CDL, I'm just going to briefly say that we are part of the University of California system, part of the Office of the President, so we sit in Oakland, just down the street. And I'm part of a group called the UC Curation Center, and at the CDL and within the UC3 group, we think about all these different kinds of tools. And so there's the Easy ID Identifier service, which I'll mention in just a sec, and the DMP tool, which I'm not going to talk about, that helps create data management plans. But we're also kind of thinking about scholarly communication, and we're working with other colleagues at the CDL to think about what that should look like for the entire UC system. And so the CDL, this is totally unauthorized things I think that we worry about, so don't quote me on this, but I personally and some of the people that I work with at the CDL think about data sharing and how to enable that, how to encourage new incentives for making sure that people think about data sharing and data management and publishing data. We think about exploring new tools that can help change the existing systems. We think about code sharing. We think about building tools, some of those tools I showed you earlier, and we're very interested in working with all of the stakeholders in the community, obviously libraries, as well as publishers and the researchers themselves. So just briefly, there's a couple of things that we're doing at the CDL. The Merit Repository is an institutional repository for any kind of digital content, and we're now shifting that focus a little bit more towards thinking about data. And so data share is our kind of implementation of that, and this is a project that we worked on with UC San Francisco to help think about making sure that data are publicly available for anybody who wants to use them, and this was focused specifically on the UCSF community, but now we're trying to think about broadening that and making it a very easy to use free platform for researchers to kind of self-archive their data. Easy ID is also something that came out of the CDL, and this is something that you may or may not have heard of, but you've certainly used identifiers that were created by Easy ID. So this is a service that creates and manages persistent identifiers, including DOIs. And Easy ID is a member of DataCite, which is the organization that actually gives out DOIs for things like data. And then e-scholarship, which is something that colleagues outside of the UC3 group are working on, but we're very excited to talk about and work with them on that. And it's basically a platform for potentially publishing your own work, but then also it's a repository for open access publications. So that open access policy that's going across the UC, this is where those publications are hopefully going to end up. So we think about all these different things and how can we contribute to that discussion and that progress towards new and better ways to communicate scholarship. And so I just want to mention a few things about data publication specifically here, and this is, again, based on John Kratz and what he's been working on as a postdoc for the last few months. So the first question is, what does this phrase actually mean? And you'd think that there's a clear definition, but it's a little fuzzy out there. But I think in general, people can kind of agree on these three basic components. That data publication means that the data are available, citable, and trustworthy. And the trustworthy is a little bit up for debate. Nobody's quite sure what we mean by that. Do we mean peer-reviewed? Do we mean it's somehow certified? Is it post-publication peer review? Is it pre-publication peer review? Is it used? We don't really know. So I'm just going to briefly talk about these three components. So in terms of availability, there's a broad spectrum of availability. There's the researchers that say, oh yeah, no, I'm totally cool with making my data available. You just have to email me, which works great until they die or something else, and then you can't actually get the data anymore and it's gone forever. Then there's something like CC0 license data that's freely available on the web. That's at the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, we want to keep pushing people towards that other end. So these are kind of the three components that people think about with available. First, of course, publish means to actually make public. It does not mean that you should have to email the author. And then the data doesn't have to be open access, which is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the type of data you're talking about. But in the same way that journal articles don't have to be open access, data doesn't have to be open access. You may have to have some sort of a subscription service to the data publisher to be able to get to it, and that still counts as being available, just not open access. And so then the question is, where do you actually put these data that you're generating? And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of repository choices. So you can go to something like re3data.org or databib.org and get a huge list of potential places to put your data. And if we kind of break these down in terms of where you can put things for your data, then really you can split it into kind of things that are general content and things that are discipline specific. And so discipline specific is the one that a lot of researchers have heard of. Something like BecoDemo, which is for marine science data, or GenBank, or Treebase. For the general content, things that aren't necessarily specific to a particular discipline, you have kind of the non-institutional versions, which are things like Figshare, which is owned by a publisher, or something more institutional like the Merit Repository, or tons of other examples of institutional repositories. So as a researcher, we need to help guide them to where they should be putting the data and what the best choice is going to be for their data. And it's not always a very simple or clear answer, but it's something that we need to have a dialogue about. So in terms of citable data, the simple case, this is the one that you're probably all familiar with. Data citations should basically be in a reference list. Wouldn't that be great if right there in the reference list you have references to the data as well? People generally agree on this five-element citation, which is looks dramatically similar to regular old journal citations. So this is a citation for data that Carl generated for some paper and published in Dryad, and so you can see it looks just like a paper citation, but it's actually to the data. There are more complicated cases. The two that tend to come up when people think about data citation is deep data citation. So what about some huge giant data set, say the human genome? What if you just want to cite some particular section or portion of that? How do you do that? How do you kind of drill down so that people understand exactly what you're trying to cite? And then the other more complicated version is dynamic data. So we've actually had people contact us about the Merit Repository and say, oh, we have this streaming data set. Data's coming in all day, every day, terabytes and terabytes of data. Can you guys help? That's a little more complicated. It's more and more often the case, and it's potentially really challenging for citation. So how do you cite a dynamic data set? What should that look like? How should it differ from a static data set? I'm not going to answer these questions, I'm just posing them. And then the next bit here is trustworthy. So being trustworthy is definitely the more complicated one, the one that's a lot more up for debate. And people often talk about peer review as being technical versus scientific. So the technical peer review tends to be mildly easier. You can say, oh, there's lots of metadata, and it's in CSV format, and it's got really great abstract and keywords, and really well-described method section, whatever. The scientific stuff, that's a little more challenging because you have to say, this is important data, or this was a great methodology for this collection, or I really trust that this data set is representative of what they're trying to say it's representative of. And it's a little more nuanced, it requires a little more expertise. The journals that are thinking about trustworthiness tend to have you review a package of information, so that usually is the data and then the paper associated with the data. I'll talk about that in a sec. Sometimes they consider impact or novelty, which is a bit of a judgment call. So again, this is kind of one of those gray areas. We're not sure how to do that. And then often they provide guidelines. So the people that are asking you to review data tend to ask those types of questions I was just kind of posing, but then also more complicated questions about that specific data set. So data publication can look like a lot of different things. I'm just going to show you kind of 3 basic examples that are divided up by the information provided next to them. So the first type of data publication is a traditional article, and so this is just data published alongside a traditional journal article. An example is supplementary material hosted by the journal, but it can also be something like putting your data in Dryad and citing that right next to your original article. So this is available and citable. The review is really up to the journal that you're submitting your original paper for. The second version is a data paper, and this is basically data that's published alongside a descriptive data paper. We're going to put that in air quotes because it's never really clear what that data paper should be. But generally they require that you put it in a trusted repository. They generally have some component of peer review. They tend to say we don't want results, analysis, or conclusions. This is just the data. And there are some standalone journals that are examples of this. So standalone journals include Nature Scientific Data or Geoscience Data. But then there's also some journals that choose to publish data papers. So Faculty of 1,000 Research is one of those examples, as well as Internet Archaeology. And then the third and final type of data publication is this idea of a standalone piece of data. So it's data published without a related journal article. So this is kind of moving further away from that publishing paradigm and thinking about what it should look like if you're just focusing on the data itself. And so generally they think about having very rich metadata that may or may not be structured. And open context is one example, which Eric will be talking about in a bit, hopefully. So when we think about this spectrum of changing nothing and changing everything in terms of publication and how we handle things, I'm really interested in knowing what it looks like on that end, on the changing everything end. I think that we have these boxes that we've built and we're trying to work within them, and we're occasionally reaching outside of the boxes, but I'd really like us to just kind of reinvent everything and see what that would look like too. I think that would be really fun. The things that I just talked about, those 3 examples, are a little more in the middle, some of them more to the nothing end and more to the everything end, but they definitely kind of fall within the realm of staying within that traditional publishing paradigm. Of course, all of this can go beyond data, and that's where we might start seeing some really interesting things that are going to start changing everything. And that includes things like code and code sharing, which I'm sure someone over here is going to talk about in just a minute. Workflows. I like to tell researchers that they better get used to sharing their data because their workflows are next, and they're going to have to start providing end-to-end, able to be analyzed workflows for their work, whether that be code or whether it be using some VizTrails or Kepler workflow software. But I think that's going to be the next phase of what we have to share, and maybe there's other things I haven't even thought about. So, takeaway, scholarly communication is changing, and I think it's for the better. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in the next few years in this space, and I think that meetings like this are really important for generating those conversations. So, I think that's all I've got here. We can now do the panel.
I'm sorry, no electric shock for you.
All right, great.
Next up is Carl Boediger talking about R open science. And do we need to connect? You'll do it?
Maybe I'll do that quickly, or
Okay.
I can just go from the hip. But yeah, is this connected?
Oh, do you want to use this?
Yeah, but maybe I should just make stuff up. I don't really have many things on the slides. Since this panel is really about your questions, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, and each of our panelists will do the same, so that you can have an idea of what kinds of things to ask. I'm here as a researcher. I'm a postdoc at Santa Cruz.
I'm working on it.
Great. And I'm also a member of this group called RF and Sci, which is just a collection of researchers just like myself. We were grad students and postdocs when we started that. And now we're working together to try to look at both ends of the spectrum Carly just talked about.
It's the right one.
Yeah. So more about, so I'll talk about both of those things. I'm interested in theoretical ecology and evolution, so I have a domain perspective here. That's good and bad. I can talk a little bit about how one particular science is tackling some of these issues. I think ecology is a fascinating case study in this because we're also kind of on both ends of the spectrum from we have great data hugging, but we also are doing some really innovative things, both within our researchers and our journals. My academic work has been on the problem of regime shifts, but of course that's always interesting to think about in this context. And I work in eco-informatics. So questions that I enjoy, open data and data publishing. I work as a researcher doing these things. Also, I see this in scientific review work, that reviewing papers both that are trying to publish data or are not publishing data, and so sometimes I can talk about those discussions. And as already alluded to, software publishing. So we're seeing that research used to have the whole package in a publication. Data was just enough that you could list into one science paper, and there was no computer, so there was no software, and that was everything. And as science has gotten more complicated, we've kind of outgrown that classic journal article. And we've just stopped putting in all of that detail. And it's been a problem. It's been a problem that's been recognized by, I'll come back to this, other people in the world. So The Economist launched this title a month ago or so, How Science Goes Wrong, and focusing on this kind of picture of science not being very reproducible. You have a description there, and you say, that sounds like a brilliant experiment, let me try it. And you get something that looks kind of like this, so you do something that looks kind of like this, and then you publish a paper, and everybody else is back to this position. So that's one aspect, I think, of the challenge of having outgrown our traditional forms of publication, that the methods no longer fit within the paper, the data no longer fits within the paper, the methods rely increasingly on computational elements that are not published or not disclosed. But that's really not the whole picture. So I think the whole picture is really a problem of scale. Science has, I said, we're in this situation to the first place because we've just gotten bigger. And we need to figure out how to do that. And I think these new technologies and also the new sort of social ways of approaching these problems are helping us tackle that scale. So as a researcher, I work kind of on both ends of this. I keep an open lab notebook, have for a long time. I can talk as a young researcher trying to pursue a tenure track position, what that's like being out in the open. You can go and see what I've been working on recently, my incomprehensible babble. But then I also publish in traditional journals, non-open access journals, anathema things around here. And overall, I'm pretty optimistic about the directions of change. I think we see them at all levels. This audience probably needs none of this, but our governments are giving mandates that say, all data produced by government agencies must be machine readable and open access by default. Our funders are moving in this direction, so NSF is one example. And our journals are moving in this direction. The group in the middle are journals that are affiliated with Data Dryad, which you saw earlier on Carly's slides. So they're requiring integrated data deposition policy. And new journals are joining this list every day. So once we just worried, if I send my paper there, can I also put a preprint up? And now we worry, is the journal integrated with a data publication system? And new journals are making more and more bold policies, like the ones that have just come out like the past week on the bottom, saying we want to be more upfront. People have to declare, not just we have a policy that no one's read that says, oh, by the way, you must release all data fast. We'll have a policy up front that says you declare where the data is and why it's not available if it's not available. The journals are also my reason for optimism because they're already thinking ahead of this, I think. This is Nature's example that journals will no longer simply be a place where you just publish description of what you've done. Journals need to move, like the rest of the world, beyond being a publisher to being a platform. But that's not the only way to be a platform. So digital science is their kind of incubator of some exciting projects that kind of help them become that platform. We're doing this kind of from a bootstrap, yikes, end of researchers saying, well, we also face this challenge. So I was once writing in my notebook about a difficult problem that I was coming across, and kind of another postdoc with a similar problem, and then Karthik, who's sitting in the back, found both of us and said, we should really organize a much bigger picture around these ideas that you guys are trying to hack out in code on GitHub and in the open. This is just a different way of thinking. And we've called our group RP and Cite. We're in a collective of developers trying to develop pieces of information to make it easier to interact with the data that already exists, to publish the data and to publish the code that's associated with work that we're doing, and also to provide an example of a social change to say that we can do this and here's what it would look like. So working on both the technical and social ends. So that's our developer team. We're lucky to have recruited a great group of members to our advisory board to tell us what to do. Not really, they mostly sit there. We love having advisory board, and we've recruited a huge community of people that have just kind of slowly come out of the woodwork joining the project, saying, this is my particular pet area in science and I want to develop the tools that help more researchers access this particular data set, more researchers publish their data in a metadata standard more easily, whatever it might be. So we see this kind of whole picture as a way of putting those pieces together. So up at the top, people are out there collecting the raw data. We need platform, and we also need the social motivation to then publish the raw data. You then sort of go down your data acquisition process, doing quality assurance, adding metadata, cleaning up the data. Again, we want that to then appear into some kind of network of data publication. Then over here you have your traditional research flow. This is where we run into things that are done in software, and we like to see them. Also the methods that you're using and the final data moving into that network. So rather than the traditional way of thinking about this, where you go all the way around the circle before you hit paper and publication, publication is kind of integral to the cycle. So one of the things we're doing is building tools that help you do that. So I can talk about that too. Thank you.
All right, and next we have Eric Kansa from the Alexandria Archive Institute and also working on something called Open Context.
Thanks, everybody, and I really appreciate Jonathan and Allison and everybody else, the invitation to come here and participate and talk about some of these things. My background's actually in archaeology, and so in some of the similar issues that Carl talked about, we're running into these same kinds of concerns in archaeology, because a lot like a lot of the ecological and environmental sciences, archaeology is sort of in this bucket of small sciences, meaning we have lots of researchers who are working on very small kinds of teams, doing very custom-tailored, I guess, handcrafted kinds of research methodologies and research questions on specific little areas that they're working on. And one of the interesting aspects of this, too, in a field like archaeology, is that our research methods are inherently destructive for the most part. So when you go out and you dig up a site, you're actually destroying that site. And the professionalism by which you're curating the research materials, the documentation that you're creating, the data that you're creating, is a huge professional responsibility. And it's actually one of these things that it's a responsibility that, unfortunately, our current professional incentive system in the academy and also outside the academy, we do a terrible job at getting researchers to adequately treat these materials, to treat their data. And this is where we're trying to sort of find a role, create a niche for ourselves with regard to data sharing in archaeology. We want to try to build up a sense of professional recognition that data are important aspects of scholarly communications and that they needed to be treated with professionalism and they need to be respected as important professional contributions by the rest of the peer community. So I sort of mentioned that, we're in the small sciences, we've got a lot of sort of heterogeneity in our data. In archaeology, we work a lot in very multidisciplinary kinds of teams. So you have people who are specialized in archaeology, but they're also working with art historians. So we definitely have heavy and deep ties with the humanities. We also work very closely with people in the geological sciences or chemistry, material sciences, all sorts of different kinds of domains, biological sciences, environmental sciences too, which mean that people are collecting different kinds of informations and different kinds of specializations, which is a tremendous data management challenge, even to understand what's happening and what archaeological site. When you have a multidisciplinary team, you have to synthesize the results of all of these kinds of different kinds of disciplines, and that is a big deal. It's a big challenge. So we sort of see our role in data sharing with open context as sort of a professional service where we work with the research community to help make their data more intelligible, not only to a larger community by publishing it and to the rest of the world, but also even the teams themselves who publish data sets with us. By working with us, we're providing professional services to clean up data, annotate it, add metadata to try to make it more intelligible, and hopefully these become data sets that become more useful to the archaeological teams themselves. So in that aspect of trying to reach one of these professional kinds of concerns, by going through a process where you have some professional services around some of these data sets, then the data become more valuable, not just for the rest of the larger world community, which is great and awesome, but even for the researchers who are producing the data themselves. And that's an important element of some of the incentive kinds of concerns. Now, what's interesting, all that is really, really hard. We're all sort of bootstrapping, trying to figure out standards. The informatics kinds of questions are really big, interesting kinds of challenges. And again, we've got all this handcrafted, locally sourced sort of organic small data. And this is very different from like the factory farm big data that you would get out of Twitter or Google. And so, you know, it really needs a lot more professional engagement. And it's not something that you could sort of relegate to just a few people. We actually need the whole archaeological community to tackle the data challenges that are inherent in archaeology, because all of those challenges are really at the sort of the crux of what it is to do archaeology. How do we bring these different kinds of things together, these different lines of evidence? And what I'm sort of concerned about when we're talking about data sharing now, especially, you know, it's really exciting that the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the White House, said, yes, we're going to have open access mandates and we're going to do data, but there's no actually money for data, right? And this is a big problem because data, especially in this kind of a context, really requires a great deal of intellectual investment. And it's got to be sustained intellectual investment. It's got to be broad, that it really requires really deep commitment by lots and lots of researchers in these different disciplinary communities. And my domain's in archaeology, so I know exactly what it takes. It really requires people to take this very seriously and to invest a lot of heavy intellectual thinking in developing the methods and theories needed to really curate and understand data. And this is a big problem because we're saying that data is important, but there's no actual resources associated with it. And what I'm worried about associated with some of this stuff is that we're going to be, mandating data, but the data that we might be filling up our repositories with might be crap. Nobody's looked at it. It's unintelligible to the rest of the world. And we've been working with a great set of researchers at the University of Michigan, something called the Dipper Project. Ishel Faniel and Elizabeth Yakel, who've been actually doing a lot of interviewing of researchers and how they actually reuse data that are in repositories. And some of the fascinating things are like, we have Excel spreadsheets, which are like the bread and butter of archaeology. Right? People throw their stuff into Excel, and they color code different fields. And that color coding and the rows and things like that, that all has meaning. It all has some great semantics. But it's terrible for anybody else to actually understand. And so they will have like numbered columns of things like, taxon of different animals that they're finding at an archaeological site, the bones, and there's a 14. And then in the interviews that we've done, the respondent would say, oh yeah, everybody knows that 14's a sheep. For them, yeah, but not for anybody else. So there's a tremendous amount of need to help researchers to curate their data, to manage it more effectively, and also to develop the sort of engagement with the community to see this as really interesting intellectually. And I think that I'm going to quit right there. I want to just talk to one last point about this sort of idea of data sharing. Because all this is really hard, we claim we publish data, which is great. Because we help provide these services to improve quality of data, annotate it, add more documentation. It's all hard to do that. The semantics are very difficult. It's a moving target about what the standards are going to be, and the standards are going to vary depending on what your needs are. There's always going to be a need to revisit data and improve the quality over time. And this is where things like version control and the kinds of modes of practice that have come out of the open source community, open source software development community, are really, really essential. So we publish data. We're not publishing static artifacts of data. We're hoping to build in the expectation that these data that we're publishing, this is an initial first stab at it, and we would like to see the data involved in continual improvement and continual adaptation as it's used to try to solve new problems. So thanks a lot.
Next up is a Boston Red Sox fan. Is Kay Thaney from the Mozilla Science Lab, which is doing lots of related activities to sharing scientific knowledge.
Need I say that Jonathan is also a Boston Red Sox fan? So thank you for the invitation to come join. Mozilla is an interesting player in this space as of about maybe 7-8 months ago, in looking at what we can possibly do to make the web work for science. And I think thinking about the web and a lot of the discussions that have, a lot of the presentations that have already happened on this panel, provides a really, really nice means of looking at some of the behavioral changes that I think most of the presenters, at least that I've seen so far, and also that are planned for the rest of the two-day program, are looking to do. Having been a part of this discussion for probably now at least 9 or 10 years, when Mackenzie was first getting DSpace off the ground, looking at the shift from having the various tools be the main stick that people were trying to enact change from, to now thinking more about how we can intervene earlier on in the process, how we can start to bring together the different stakeholders that all are pushing on different levers to see what we can possibly do to have impact in this space. Mozilla has entered into this area to be that group that can help convene and help to add that lens of stitching together the conversations that are happening around open content, bringing together the tool providers like Carl and Carly and a number of others in the room, and the scientific startups and others, to start to test out how to actually get their infrastructure to work together, that we don't necessarily need this idea of a monolith platform that will have everything stitched into it, but we can start to use the technologies that are really there in the underpinning of the web to test out means of getting them to work together. But the broader mission of this is to really start to support a lot of the activity that's already been going on in this space, and to start to take some of the characteristics that at least I associate with the web, of having information that can move freely throughout the system with minimal friction, having it have the ability to bring together different communities, and also to have the ability to innovate more freely with this new, backbone that can allow this information to move. And also the fact that you can break it apart, build it on top of it very easily without having to ask for as much permission. A lot of the things that in the preambles about where science has come from, if you look back to Newton when publication first started, et cetera, even through some of the other references that were given in the first series of panels, first series of speakers, looking at getting back to those nobler goals of what science is really supposed to be all about. The idea of writing something down or publishing your work so that someone can take that, use it to build upon it, and then be able to share that back out, but without some of the other complicated human effects that have somehow crept into the system. So what we're doing for Mozilla, we've got a couple of different programs that are looking at not only stitching together these different conversations, whether they're with practicing researchers that are entering into this as an undergraduate undergrad or as an early graduate student, and how we can provide them with the skills to do more of what Carl and Eric were describing here about how to deal with the surplus of information that we have in front of us, so they can do more meaningful science with less friction there. But also to look at how we can start to bring together some of these tools to examine behavioral changes and interventions in the process, not only by getting some of these tools and technical components to work together, but also to use that to generate a larger conversation about best practice in some of these components, as we again continue to see the bits that were otherwise locked in a paper, even just recently in the last 5-7 years, start to be broken apart so people have an ability to interact with the data, have more surface area that they can use to share and build upon research, and even now increasingly looking at code. So now what does this look like in practice? We had a project recently launched this past December that brings together GitHub, the code repository. I think most people in the room are familiar with GitHub, at least in some regard. But bringing together GitHub, Figshare, the data repository that Carly was speaking of earlier on today, and looking at how we can build a bridge between, just to show what is possible. This is not full-on product development. Did that in previous digital science work, but looking more at kind of testing out what that functionality would look like for those that are working now in an area where they might not identify as being a computational researcher, and this is another gap that we should probably shelve for the discussion afterwards, but that are increasingly starting to do data analysis or writing small scripts to help, look at other distributed information sources and what they can possibly do with that. How they can share that code in the scholarly research system by pushing that to something like Figshare, where they might be able to get a digital object identifier, which, while not fully necessary to be able to cite code, is still one of the most trusted, and I know that Jeff Builder's not in the room because he and I have had a lot of conversations about this, but still is seen as the gold standard in the same sort of way that the citation for a paper is still what's most regularly counted for those that are looking at having their CV built on for promotion and tenure purposes. Seeing if we can look at the same sort of things that have happened in the data space in the last 5 to 7 years, about the behaviors and about the shift about looking at the properties that might be more data specific than paper specific, and how we can start to generate a discussion about what does that mean for reuse, what does that mean for versioning and for archiving, and what does that mean for being able to get these two essentially content archives, so looking at different forms of information, to work together. And this is not necessarily something that only Mozilla can do. We are essentially serving as the broker to get these groups to come to the table. It's all done through open APIs, open browser technologies, etc., just to be able to have this to test with researchers who are increasingly finding this part of their workflow to say, is this useful? And if not, let's go back to the drawing board. But also, we have a number of publishers on that are interested as well to be able to test this out. Some of which, one that I was speaking to last week, that put in front of me an editorial from 2007 about software citation in Nature Methods, which was espousing all of this utopian future that we are all looking to move towards. But as with many of these policies, was something that had a lot of different gray areas that could be up for interpretation as to how it was going to be enforced. And so seeing what we can do to not only put this in front of the researchers, how we can start to discuss the broader concepts about reuse and best practice. What is the Miami standard equivalent for those of you that work in assays? What is the Miami standard equivalent for code? What are the 5 minimal things so that someone can pick it up and use it readily for that? And doing that and having the community participate in that, so it's not just coming from one organization or another, but then also getting the technical providers or the technology providers to work together, looking at others that could help test this and pilot this in various journals, institutional repositories, etc. And so this is where we are looking to further explore, looking at ideas that can really help show by doing, by getting these groups to work together, but also to provide those scientifically compelling prototypes that almost poke at some of these bigger, thornier issues so that we can start generating a bigger discussion around these different components and how we can push forward scientific research. With that, I will hand it back to Carly to lead our discussion.
Is this how this, hey, look, it works. Yeah, so I think maybe we could take some questions from the audience. We have plenty of time for that, 45 whole minutes. Go panel. We rule, leaving lots of time. So are there any questions from the audience about anything? Got a couple.
Hi, I'm Frank Kurtz. I'm from the Department of Human Ecology here at UC Davis. First, a very simple direct question to Eric, and then one more to all four of you. What is the difference, what your problem is you're describing to what was 1946, the development of the human relations area files? So is it just simply a card catalog done differently? So just to understand sort of what is the conceptual difference between that and sort of this kind of idea. But to all four of you, and also in a way to the panelists earlier, I failed to understand the difference between scientific communication within a science and communication about science. Where is the difference? Is there really a difference in what decides what is communication and what is not? And whether sort of we are dangling with that ambiguity or gray zone or whatever it is.
Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Yeah, okay, great. Just to give you a little bit of background, you referenced the human relations area files, which was a long-standing project, I believe, at Yale University, which essentially has a database. It's curated by them. It's created by them that has abstracted a bunch of information about different human communities that ethnographers have visited and documented. And it's this big database of abstracted information from ethnography for the most part. The big difference between us and that kind of a project, with Open Context, we publish data that's created by teams of field researchers themselves. And so we publish their data. We also annotate the data, and we put it through a cleanup process to make it more consistent and easier to use. And it goes on the web, and then we archive the data with the California Digital Library, with the Merit Repository. So we are essentially more of a publishing service, not just building up a database that we're creating ourselves. Now, I want to also highlight, though, it's not just academic researchers that are in this game, too, of creating really valuable scientific data. We also have to worry in a lot of different fields, and you could probably speak to this too, Carl, about data that's created by researchers who are working in other institutional contexts. So in archaeology, about 90% of it's probably done by heritage management researchers who are working either for the government or through private contractors who are involved in some sort of compliance kind of archaeology. They go out and build archaeological data as part of environmental impacts, surveys around historical preservation laws, that kind of thing. They have a whole suite of different legal and incentive issues and cost issues associated with them too. And we're trying to help tackle some of those things right now also. But it's not the sort of landscape of what is sort of scientific or, and in our case, we're sort of sloppy between the humanities and sciences anyway. What is sort of in play around what's needed for open data involves lots of different institutional contexts, not just academia.
Did anybody want to respond to the question about communication?
Let's see. Okay. I saw Greg before holding down this button, so I'm going to assume that I have to hold down this button. So to your question, if I'm understanding it correctly, there was actually an anecdote. I believe Jennifer Lynn's still in the room, from the Public Library of Sciences meeting about article level metrics they had this past October in San Francisco. A really, really interesting discussion evolved from that, where most in the room were talking about how to actually measure the influence and measure impact in various sorts of ways. So you had people that were looking at that based on an article level or the various components within, looking at different things around alternative impact factors, or how even once the research is published, how that percolates through social media, blogosphere, looking at various things there. And about midway through the second day, a conversation actually started organically about, are we actually talking about the same thing? And is our terminology, have we fallen into the trap that we actually started doing this work to get out of by framing it as article level metrics and instead of alternative metrics? And it was quite possibly the first time that at least I had been in the room where there had been that self-awareness, that we were looking at a lot of the issues because many of the behavioral tracking systems, so to speak, or altmetric systems to date, and they're quickly evolving now to involve looking at some of the metrics that are pulled from data repositories and other non-content in the traditional sense repositories, and also looking at GitHub as more researchers are starting to use open repositories in that sense. But otherwise, we're still hinged upon written content, even though they were framing it as alternative. And so I think that discussion is slightly shifting, and I don't have, that's kind of a cop-out for saying I don't really have a real answer for you as to what that looks like, but I think it's a very good issue to raise.
I'll just add into that. So I think one answer is easy to say. Scientist or researcher will say something I can put on my CV is part of a publication description. That is scientific communication. Things that are communication that I cannot put on my CV, I put into the other category. But I think this is too stark, and I agree with Caitlin that it's too easy for us to focus on that. That at practicing as a researcher, you are reminded every day that science is still a human enterprise and communication is still communication. And the path to being a successful scientist is often people communicating good ideas, however that happens. You need to be able to play the game as part of scientific publication, but that's not the be-all and end-all, and it really never was. So those other works that people have been doing, whether it's been publishing the data, making a human genome accessible to the world, whether it has been providing a software product that is used by your subdiscipline extensively, those have always been recognized by the humans that make up your science.
So if I understand you correctly, so as I come back, is that you're not comparing communication, but you're comparing games. So you're comparing different rules in which games are played, and the communication is the outcome, because a game can only be played when it is played, and so that's what we compare, not communication. Is that sort of what we have to get? So therefore, the game that scientists play is a different one that tenure and review organizations play, or that writing a CV play. So these are two different games. It is chess or playing cards.
I just think it's not as black and white.
So to add to that also, keep in mind, so I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the Polymath Project and Tim Gowers. So that was actually conducting research on his blog. And by far the most impactful thing to that was the fact that he had, how many top Fields medalist mathematicians were actually sorting out the problem in the open on his blog. Now, would that be something he would list on his CV? So it's like, again, looking at, I would certainly hope so, but if not, his loss, anyone else's gain. But looking at also the gray area that this is evolving into. And I think to your point about the ways things are starting to be credited, increasingly, and we know this because of just a call for testers for some of the work that we're doing with GitHub and Figshare in the first instance. Various publishers that have come to us have said that they will start looking at people's GitHub accounts as a published bit that is almost interchangeable with the method section of other papers. And so they're starting to look at not having it be this crisp black and white, because having followed in what we've seen with various preprint services, where there are still some publishers as recent as 2 to 3 years ago that were still stripping out archive identifiers from people's bibliographies, looking now to say it's almost the equivalent of filing your preprint, that you're not going to be precluding yourself from actually publishing by putting something in GitHub or a data repository, and that we'll start counting that on their own, especially as data publications and other sort of communications, so to speak, start entering into more traditional publishing arenas as well.
Another question?
Just in the interest of self-awareness again, this is for the entire panel. I wonder, when you talk about data publishing, are you talking about raw data publishing or making raw data available, as opposed to data to which meaning has been assigned And I think those are two very different issues, especially with respect to workflow and so on and so forth. Because I really appreciate the idea of archaeology destroying what they're looking at. In a sense, all science destroys what they look at. You know, what you're recording is something that happened in the past and it will never be exactly recreated. So can you comment on the idea of publishing raw data as opposed to data to which meaning has been assigned?
I can comment on that and then default to you guys if anybody has something to add. But you just hit on the question that is on everybody's mind when we talk about data publishing is which data? Where do you actually start publishing the data? And there's some guidelines that people put out there about what you should or shouldn't bother publishing. Raw data, people tend to say, yeah, keep your raw data. And then if you have the workflow next to the raw data, then people can run your raw data and get your results, and then you're good to go. But there's the question of, well, what about simulations, right? I did some work where I had simulations, huge data files result from that, and nobody wants that. So in that case, no, I shouldn't archive those raw data. I should archive the code that I used to generate the simulations and the parameters that I used to generate those simulations, and that should be sufficient. So it's nuanced. I think that the answer is going to change depending on the project, and I think right now data publishing relies very much on the researcher kind of assessing what they think is most important for reproducing their work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is always both. We want to see the raw data, and you want to see the final published data. And to the scientist, I think that role is clear too. That one is trying to communicate your work, with a publication, and you want people to build upon that. So by publishing the interpreted, understood data, you're making it much easier for people within your own discipline and attracting citations and impacting people in your own discipline. And I think raw data is your relatively inexpensive, now there's processing and challenges to publishing anything, but inexpensive way to cast your own impact that much broader. That people who are not within your sub-discipline can find things in your raw data. And to some extent, those people are not competing for publication priority in the same ideas that you are. So I think we want to encourage both.
And I'm guessing Eric's going to say this, but while he's adjusting the mic, I'll say it's also often pointed out that if you can't reproduce the data, if it's not attainable again, if you only got one shot at it, you should save it.
What she said.
Great.
No, I agree with all the comments on the panel so far on this point. I think that a lot of it is also considering that data are also, you want to think about it not just as a sort of like, almost like a compliance thing of showing your work so that somebody thinks you're reproducible, but it's also sometimes, at least in the case of archaeology, often an aspect of storytelling. And it is, there's an element of exhibitionism that some people want to have in sharing data, in sharing a gazillion photographs of interesting artifacts and things like that too. That is also an important aspect here too. So it's that sort of positive incentive and that idea of it's similar motivation for a lot of museums to put up their major museums to put up their collections online too. It's demonstrating sort of the wealth of material that they've documented.
Way up at the front, microphone people.
A question, this is a question for the whole panel. I mean, I start thinking about the question listening to Carly's talk, but so I see kind of broadly two kind of clusters of representations of data. So on one side, there is the, data that needs to be preserved for accountability reasons. So data connected to an article, workflow, and so on. But then there is also this another layer of, more connected to the raw data. Like data, we need to preserve it anyway, right? So, and there is no discussion about, for instance, well, look, even dead people in cemeteries eventually get removed. So by what time, at what time do you turn the switch? Like, so for instance, there is a data that is relevant to assess an article. Should we say that the data should be available for 5 years, 6 months? But it seems to me 100 years, no. Probably 15 years, neither. I mean, to go back to your slides of the manuscripts. which, by the way, in most cases, we don't have the manuscripts of old scientists, right? Actually, really, in most cases. But, that is used by historians, it's not used by scientists, right? So what is the time life of useful data? So, and to me, the fact that I don't see those questions, at least in this, it makes me feel like, that there is the second kind of representation of data that seems to be, data is potentially infinitely useful precisely because it is meaningless now. So it might have an infinite amount of applications later on. So it's the perfect thing that you can claim that you have to preserve, right? But we have no evidence of it. So why not thinking about specific taxonomies of data and also, the times when the switch should be turned off?
Okay, I'll take this. I am not a librarian, but I pretend to be one when I work at the CDL. And I will say, the librarian in me wants so badly to save everything, but, archive it all. But then I'm actually not a hoarder in real life. And so it's important to notice, like, you can't keep everything. And how do you make those decisions? And there's a lot of discussion going on about that in the researcher community, or in the library community especially. The data repository community, because there's not unlimited storage. There's a lot of storage, but there's not unlimited storage. And so some of the approaches that are being taken are things like, well, maybe we should archive it for 10 years for everybody, and then if nobody's touched it or opened it since it was deposited, we can get rid of it. Or if the researcher thinks it's important enough, then they can pay for 100 years of storage, right? But it's nuanced, right? And you're very right that there are two kind of camps of data here. There's a lot of overlap in the kind of Venn diagram, but there's the data that you analyze that you need for reproducibility, and then there's the just intrinsic value of that raw data, and it's those are all judgment calls that somebody is going to have to make somewhere along the way. And so I think that the repositories are hoping that the researchers themselves are going to help with some of those decisions, that peer review and, kind of the researchers that are maybe, helping the libraries make those decisions will be able to say, like, oh, look, that data, it's some poor little grad student did a terrible job. Let's throw that out, or this is an amazing data set of butterflies. We should keep this around forever. And but it's going to have to be curated. I mean, that's the word we're talking about here is curated collections of data that are going to require expertise from the library community, I think, in conjunction with the researchers to figure out what to keep and what to throw out.
It's a relative question that we should be able to do at least as well with our data as we can do with our publishing already. And the bar right now across most of my field is so much lower than that you will be able to get those papers 30, 40 years down the line, whether or not you can do anything interesting with them, whether or not you can still rerun the software that they needed to get those results and so forth. And yet you can't even get the data when the paper comes out because you email them and your email gets lost in the discussion. So we're just trying to bring things up more relatively into line than to absolutely solve that problem.
I think this is a really interesting question. I think a lot of it is going to have to be learned through experience because we don't know exactly what people in the future are going to be wanting. And unfortunately, that might change also. So it's kind of a moving target. I know just a little bit of the disciplinary history in a field like archaeology. We routinely use documentation that comes from very early sources. I mean, early excavations or early museum collections from 150, 200 years ago even. This stuff never stops being used. So at least we're, relatively speaking, a lot smaller than like a particle collider, so we're not a huge burden on our digital libraries. But that's... so please don't throw us out. But I think it's an interesting question. There are some data sets that we're now collecting in archaeology, say remote sensing, certain kinds of, using certain kinds of sensors that are generating very, very, very big, significant data sets that would be a burden for storing for a really long time. And we don't know exactly how useful those are going to be. So I have a really hard time answering that because all I know is I don't know.
Wait, before we move on, I just want to mention that my answer clearly indicated that I am really excited about institutional repositories being the place where we put data, and that there are going to be librarians that help out with that process. So,
Could I go? I've had my hand up for a while. Diane Harley from Berkeley, and this question is for Eric. I know you've been doing open context for a while. We've heard, especially in the earlier session, about slow change. Could you tell us anything about acceptance of that paradigm of publishing data in archaeology? And it is a very interesting field, because I think it's more complex than others.
Yeah, acceptance is a hard question too. I mean, in the sense that if you were to ask most archaeologists, would they be happy to sort of throw up their data? Most of them would probably say no. And mostly, it's not because they're necessarily wanting to hoard it and they're evil people that they want other people not to ever see what they're doing. It's usually a sense of they don't have time for that kind of thing. It requires a lot of investment. And that's just generally the case. However, there are some 6,000 people in the Society for American Archaeology. If we only get 1% of them interested in sharing data, we're really, 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 really busy. And I can tell you, we're really, 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 really busy. So in the sense of the sort of wanting to participate, thinking about data as something that they want to publish in some sort of a value-added kind of a manner, rather than a sort of a minimum kind of a compliance of, you know, I'll archive my data, but I won't actually do much to do it except for filling out my name, title, and maybe a keyword or two. That kind of a thing is definitely not the norm in archaeology. However, we have enough people wanting to participate this to sort of, I think, justify our existence.
I'll just say on the ecology side, I think it's very similar. We also live in a world of small, little organic data for the most part that people hold on to very tightly. But we've also seen a lot of change that when you step back and look on longer timescales, we've come a long way in 10 years. That since Dryad has formed not just as a technical repository, but as a consortium of journals, and the journals were all able to kind of hold each other's hands and say, we're going to make this leap together. And enough of them did that at once that now many more journals are joining every year, saying we're going to implement these standards that our community might otherwise be lukewarm about, and if one of us did it, it might just drive authors away to go to some other journal. And so we're seeing that change in small steps, and enough change that now there's the data sitting out there for this huge potential of anyone who can do something clever with it.
Can I just add one thing? We've had an interesting recent success in the sense that we worked with a team of researchers that were already a tightly knit community that had built up a lot of social bonds of trust between them, that they wanted to exchange data. This is zooarchaeology. These are people who study animal bones from archaeological sites. And they were all working in Turkey, studying the origins of the domestication, you know, the first farming. And they already had these ties together. They were talking about data sharing, and they did data sharing with us. They published the data with us in the context of trying to address research questions that they can only answer by looking at each other's results in a really deep way. And that, you know, sort of flips the dynamic in that area now. So if you're working as a zooarchaeologist in that part of the world, it's going to be hard to hide your results now because so much of your community have done it now. That have participated. So I think it's a little crystallization here and there that of getting sort of a critical mass of people engaged in something like this that sort of changes the dynamic.
Mitchell Brown. I'm a librarian from Irvine. I work with chemistry and earth system science. And the curious thing is, several of my questions were answered in the previous responses, but the challenge is, I work with faculty, I work with graduate students who do modeling, fire events, but also do atmospheric modeling. They would love to be able to find similar data. They would love to be able to share it. Because increasingly questions come up and they need this kind of interesting data set. Curiously, they're also asking for animal information, plant physiology information, because their modeling progresses. Part of my challenge is, am I teaching the researchers the need for this? Am I teaching the graduate students how to properly think about data as part of their research? I think faculty are asking this too. Is it something that the libraries or the academics should be teaching graduate students, or is it something the researchers teach? Where do people learn about this? And what's the driving point? Do I do it because I think it's something valuable, or do I do it because it's something I need to do? So how do we get this? How do we get people interested in thinking that this is an important part of their research cycle?
So we actually run an educational program to teach technical skills to research. Eric just wrote on his pad of paper an arrow. That was it. Well played, well played. So this is a, backing up and giving a bit of history because, hey, we've got 20 minutes. Backing up and giving a bit of history. I've worked in various contexts at bits of this problem, from the Creative Commons side and actually around the open data protocols and open access and freeing up information, from the tools side over at digital science and whatnot. The one missing thing to all of that is that if you are creating tools or creating policies for those that are already kind of inherently doing things, you're missing out on a number of other researchers that either are, unless they are seeking and pursuing a computational flavoring of a traditional scientific discipline, or even probably with parallels in the digital humanities, they are not even getting introduced to some of the concepts that are needed in terms of core competencies to allow them the same sort of ability to not only pursue things like version control, which is something that we teach in these 2-day boot camps for something called software carpentry, but also the ability to go forth and to look at other data sources to have a little bit of more efficiency added to their process. Not necessarily teaching to specific technologies, but some of those core concepts that can really help serve as that underlying push out the door to allow them to have, additional power behind what they're doing. And the interesting thing that's come about for that, to give some numbers, in the last year, maybe year and 2 months, we've reached 3,500 students. And these are everything from librarians to researchers across all wide array of disciplines. These are not CS students. These are those that are sitting there now doing a little bit more data analysis or having to write a script to be able to, run their simulation more efficiently. And they're struggling because it's not being introduced across the board in terms of a digital literacy or a means to help them with some of this work. So I think you hit the nail right on the head. And we're constantly looking for ways of helping to introduce this and build this into more of the process, and working with other educators and policymakers, et cetera, to help embed this into the current system instead of having to do it with 2 days of forgiveness from a PI to take their grad students and to teach them some of these introductory concepts. But there are other programs as well, and I know that some of the work that Carl and Karthik Graham, who's in the back of the room, have been doing, are looking again at how to provide some of this entry-level education. Well, I wouldn't necessarily categorize it entry level. Is that okay? Yeah. Before I get rained down on by the panelists next to me, but to look at how we can start to introduce some of these concepts, and to take some of my Mozilla colleagues' terminology that this shouldn't be only for wizards to do, that every researcher is going to start to be needing to do some of these more computationally driven, data-driven things, and how can we match the skills to that to better enable them to push that out the door.
I'll also add that I attended a software carpentry boot camp and learned a lot. It was really great, and I'm a huge proponent of their work. And it's basically a package of work that you can, or a workshop that you can take to a group and teach them these skills that are really important using trained instructors. And so I've been really interested in trying to figure out how to get UC librarians to help facilitate these software carpentry boot camps on the UC campuses. And so I think there's a role. I think there's a role for librarians. I think there's a role for the research community to accept that this is something they need to think about. I get a lot of pushback from my old grad school colleagues who say, oh, geez, yeah, of course you're a proponent of, using software carpentry techniques or GitHub or version control because, you did MATLAB in grad school, but I used Excel, and so I can't possibly know about that. So I think there's pushback. There's pushback from the science community of, we're learning so much, we're really stressed out. And I think that it needs to come from the higher ups in the research community to say that this is really important and this is a skill set that you can't afford not to have as a researcher anymore. The ability to handle data, the ability to write high quality code if that's part of your work, and the ability to kind of know that you're documenting and archiving it well so that it is reproducible.
Sorry, go ahead, Carl. I was going to say, just to add to that really, really quickly, 2 quick things. Also looking now at building out beyond that traditional curriculum into working with data, because there are basic concepts around with data sharing being sort of that prerequisite, but around analysis, around visualization that we're hoping to start to do some exploratory work with some of our instructors on. But beyond that, there's been an interesting shift between those that identify as computational scientists and those that actually do computational research that don't. So trying to say to them, these are technical skills that are needed. We get a lot of pushback, even though the base level that we're looking at for the boot camps are those that their main data analysis is done through things like Excel. Because sorry, Alex, as much as we love or hate it, it is the common denominator for many that are doing some work with data. So I think that also trying to figure out what the proper framing is. I mean, the goal of this is not to teach scientists to code, though if they want to do that, better on them, but to give them enough to have the equivalent of opening the hood of your car and understanding how to talk to the mechanic as to troubleshooting what's going on, giving that shift in practice.
So this is a follow-up in part to Diane Harley's question and related to Mario's question, which is, and I'm partially responsible for this, we're an open group of people here. We're researching how to do digital technology and share data. And what about not the people who don't want to learn software carpentry, but what about the fields where there really is reluctance to share data in any way? And in the sort of reverse world compared to Mario, there was a recent editorial in PLOS Biology suggesting that many fields might share data more if you allowed embargoes on the data, up to 5 years. That is, rather than how long does the data last before we have to clear out the cemetery of the old data, but how long should we keep the data hidden before we let people have access to it? So I'm wondering, in your experiences, how much have you what are the ways that we can get other fields that are, or should we get other fields that are really resistant to releasing data in some way, or individuals? What do we do to try and spread scientific knowledge in those areas?
I'll take a stab at that. I think this is a great question because that's really underlying the real challenges here. And I think someone who is, say, an economist looking at our system of publishing data and are struggling to get there might be confused that we have this thing, this data that's really valuable. Everybody knows that if they could get their hands on it, they could have all these great papers and it would be their pathway to careers. And yet the person who has it may not be the best person to extract value from it. Say it's an ore and you have to smelt it. It feels they need to just hold on to that thing because it has no value until they smelt it into whatever they can, till they're done. And then people can jump onto it. So we have created the system externally that says there is no value to something that we all recognize as really valuable. And so on one hand, sure, that's an incentive problem that has to do with the ways that our reward systems work. But on the other hand, the people that should really be winning, to me it's a bit of a paradox, a data paradox, that the people that should really be winning from this are not the computational scientists who are so eager to grab other people's data and have an easy path to fame and glory, but the people that hold that most valuable thing, which, because we all recognize this familiar paradox to everybody, that data is valuable. They hold that value. But they should be able to be winning by us recognizing that. And I think that we make the problem seem worse than it is. So yes, one of the questions is we need to move and a rate that a community can adapt, and embargoes might help us get there. But at the same time, it's worth recognizing that science is just terribly competitive right now, and it's hard to get a career doing just about anything. And so doing something different and being able to make your mark with something that the world already knows is really valuable may not be out of the question.
This is one of these areas where something like altmetrics could be really useful, and it's sort of which is predicated on a couple different things too. So, oftentimes data could be more useful or more easily recognized if it's I guess I don't know what the maybe if it's like published like in a way that's sort of more part of the web, isn't just on the web. You know, so that altmetrics kinds of things, mechanisms that collect social media interactions around web resources can be used on the kind of research materials that people are creating. So part of that is almost a design decision around like repositories, data publishers, or whatever, to be really, really, really well integrated with the rest of the World Wide Web in order for these sort of things to be able to be collected more easily. The problem with this also is if we just rely on something like altmetrics, then you could get into a situation where your dean is beating you up because you don't have a great Twitter clout, right? And it could become also sort of a nasty sort of tool of surveillance in a sort of a tailorized way of the way that, you know, we have to worry about labor conditions in academia. And I think, Carl, you know, you talked about it, that it's intensely competitive. Sticking your neck out to do something sort of innovative that outside of the bonds that people don't immediately recognize as valuable it can be dangerous, especially if you're a junior person. And I in some ways around data, around these different kinds of fields that have perverse incentives around data, a lot of the problem seems to be just really revolve around those conditions of the academic labor marketplace right now. And I don't know how to solve that without sort of identifying that that is an issue. And you know, it's going to be really requiring big changes in public policy about how we finance research and education.
I will add something to that, which is I get really angsty when people start talking about data embargoes. It makes me uncomfortable because it just goes against the whole point of open science and open data, and I understand why people ask for them, but I also think that the people that are asking for them are probably not very excited about sharing their data in the first place, and so, you know, maybe we should look at why they're not excited about sharing their data, and so then that might have to do with the incentive structure. That's what we're kind of all hinting at here, and I think that I'll just bring up that I think one of the big problems is it takes a long time to do this, to actually prepare your data and make it available for somebody else to use. And we can't pretend that that's not the main reason people don't share data. It's the main reason most of my data isn't shared. It's not because I don't think I should share it, it's because it's a hot mess. It's just a pile of spreadsheets, and I would have to like really clean that up to make it usable, and I just don't have the time. So it's not a matter of embargoes. It's not a matter of you know, of that kind of thing. It's just a matter of finding the time to actually do it. And I think that's where we need to start thinking about these incentives and giving people credit and those types of nice things. The embargoes, I feel like, are something we should worry about later, even though it's something that always gets brought up when we talk about data sharing.
Next. Yep. So this is a very related question. As somebody who worries about the long-term availability of data and software as part of the scholarly record, you touched on dynamic data very briefly and then whizzed right by it. Because of course, you know, for a lot of the things we're talking about, the data isn't static the way a publication would be. And you know, as the organization that's responsible in part for making sure that it's still usable down the road for a variety of purposes, I get asked a lot to weigh in on financial and social sustainability of this kind of stuff, right? I think pretty much everybody here has asked about that. So what are your thoughts about how we can begin to acknowledge the long life of this stuff and the fact that it requires continuous investment? And does that introduce another dimension to this curation question and the longevity question if we know that we're going to be reinvesting in a piece of software, a piece of data every single year for the rest of time? Thoughts?
So
I'm making you answer because I always think of code when I think of like dynamic data.
So I'll talk to the software side of it since I've been set up to do that. So, I mean, I think as a community, that's something we're starting to tackle, which is great. It's the first step. And I think it's going beyond the picture of the software has to live forever, but that the software has to have a life cycle that we can acknowledge as a community and signpost. This is early development software. You know, it's been published. It might work. It worked for the use case that I have. This is widely used software throughout the community now. We trust it. We've found some bugs. It has active developer. It has an active mailing list. You can find the mistakes. You can keep track of the versions. This software is now on its sunset phase. You know, it is no longer reliable. It has been replaced by some other things. Maybe we need to archive it, but in a much weaker context. I was part of a discussion group called ICs, looking at sustainable software for ecology and environmental sciences based on NSF funding. We're hoping that a center will come out of that proposal, and people will continue to think about how we do that.
And this is also something that's really tied into some of the best practice work that we're trying to surface through even just this work with GitHub and Figshare as a prototype. I mean, really, what does it mean to necessarily push something like that to an archiving service? I mean, is it looking at just a snapshot of the code, knowing that the code base is going to continue to evolve, and this might just be one iteration that you want to refer back to? So a lot of these things that are rooted in some of the technical aspects, but much more on the cultural side, because we don't really know, at least in terms of how to best capture that metadata so that it is reflecting some of that natural life cycle of the software, because in the grand scheme of things, it is just a small amount of time in comparison to some of the other practices that have evolved to help with this otherwise.
Yeah, and I think what I was trying to think of articulating is that on that continuum of changing nothing and changing everything, I think that the changing everything end is where we can start thinking about really interesting ways of solving this problem of changing software and changing data and these kind of evolving things that we have to figure out a way to curate. And it's, maybe it has something more to do with connecting them to, annotation systems, or it's some way of upvoting and downvoting, those types of things that people are thinking about with software in the open source community. How do we try and use those as some sort of an indicator for the data, the dynamic data, and how to slice the data, and if there's a change to the data, and if there's a correction, like how do we deal with that? So I think there's some interesting things that we can learn from the software community and how they're handling it, but I also kind of hope that we just come up with something totally, completely different. And by we, I mean really smart people that probably know a lot more about that than me.
I'm not a digital library person or preservation. I'm really as a sort of more of a consumer of these kinds of services. But as a consumer of digital library and digital curation services, I would love it. It would be really cool to have something like the Merit repository integrated with Git. And that would be an interesting kind of approach also that would solve a lot of problems for me also. But that's just on one little technical side. There's streaming data and there's streaming data. There's vastly different kinds of scales and different types of data in different sorts of areas. I'm typically working with pretty small data that's around essentially a lot of text and structured text and this type of thing that's sort of relatively easy to handle. But that would still be something that would be kind of neat from my perspective.
There's a guy in the back, according to Twitter, who has had his hand up for 5 minutes. Who is that guy?
Thanks. Stephen Johnson from One Mind for Research. We work in the area of data sharing in neuroscience. I just want to comment on Jonathan's question on data embargoes. And you can actually look at what's happening in neuroscience as kind of a laboratory for data sharing and incentives. So on the one hand, you have real-time data sharing in areas like Alzheimer's disease, where I think the incentives were that each individual scientist and each individual pharmaceutical company realized they're getting nowhere alone. The only way forward was as a group. Then you have other areas in neuroscience which, for cultural reasons, which I think are sort of similar to those in the field of archaeology, where suddenly the entire field, probably as a result of human genome, moved towards open data sharing. And then there's another area, one example with traumatic brain injury, where collecting the data is incredibly arduous. You can collect Alzheimer's data at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Most TBI data is literally coming from a battlefield or a civilian equivalent of a battlefield, like San Francisco General at 1 a.m. on Sunday morning. And there, in that field, it's moving towards open data sharing, but it also has data embargoes, as the balance is between the scientists who are up at 1 a.m. collecting the data versus the data analyzers who can do it at 10 o'clock after a cup of coffee on Wednesday morning. So you see the balance, you know, in an evolving system, there's a balance between the incentives of the data creators who currently do not have a method of being cited other than being co-authors on papers, and the data analyzers. And the other thing I say on data embargoes is that's kind of a terminology issue. If you change data embargo for 6 months to data release after 6 months, it sounds a lot greater and different and better, because the reality is that most data has never been released. So if you actually have a data embargo of 6 months or 12 months, that's a light year's difference from how it has been in many areas of medical science. So release versus embargo, you can call it a good thing or a bad thing. Thanks.
All right, thank you, panel, and all the audience members, and I think it was Chris Ham who informed the panel about the question in the back. And now we're going to have a lunch break until 2 o'clock, and we can, if people have questions about places to go, the outsiders, we can talk about it in the back here. We're starting back up at 2 o'clock, and don't be late, because Victoria Stodden is talking then, and she's awesome.